Okay. Well, hello, everyone. I am so excited to welcome you to today's virtual USA Gap Year Fair. We are thrilled to be hosting you this afternoon. Just a quick note before we get started, I wanted to remind you that while this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with registered participants, the provider info sessions following the webinar are not recorded. So definitely be sure to check those out so you don't miss any important content. Thanks, Drew. And thank you all again for joining us live and coming prepared with questions, I hope. I am super excited for what we have in store for you today, and I wanted to just take a really quick minute to introduce myself so you know who's speaking at you. My name is Claire Ling, and I'm the Outreach and Events Coordinator for USA Gap Year Fairs and Go Overseas. You'll see in some of these photos here that I've taught abroad with Fulbright, advised international TOEFL trainees, worked with Gap Year students in Costa Rica, you name it. So needless to say, gap years and international education is something I'm really passionate about, and I'm thrilled more than anything to be here today to help you achieve the gap year adventure of your dreams. My fantastic colleague, Drew, is joining us as well today and helping out behind the scenes, manning the slides and dropping links throughout this webinar. Thank you so much, Drew. So this event is hosted by Go Overseas, which you can think of as Yelp, but for meaningful travel experiences. On gooverseas.com, you can browse programs, read verified alumni reviews, and explore other resources such as articles, guides, and scholarships. If you're inspired today to take the leap and start planning your gap year, this is a great place to do your research and find your best fit program. And before we really dive into the afternoon, or rather evening's core programming, just a quick overview of what to expect today. So we'll start off the event with a Gap Year 101 webinar given by the Gap Year Counselor Extraordinaire, Jane Sarouhan of J2Guides. Woohoo! Then you'll get to interact with Gap Year program providers during the actual virtual fair, and Jane and I will be in the Ask an Expert Help Center throughout in case you have any questions or just want to continue that Gap Year 101 conversation. So speaking of the Help Center, something I do want to highlight, which will be your very best friend throughout the entire virtual fair, is the Attendee Hub, which we're dropping a link to right now. Please bookmark this page because this is going to be your home base for the entire virtual fair experience. You'll use the Zoom links inside the hub to access providers' info sessions and Q&As. If you ever lose your hub link, you can always find it in your Zoom reminder emails for this event. Now, before I introduce our wonderful speaker for the evening, I wanted to take a quick moment to share a few super helpful Gap links with you to check out before, during, or after this event. So first up, the USA Gap Year Fair's landing page. And do I have some exciting news to announce here? So Go Overseas and USA Gap Year Fairs is thrilled to announce that we'll be giving away $5,000 in Gap Year funding this year through our 2022 Gap Year Scholarship. It literally takes less than 2 minutes to start your application. So I'm going to encourage all of you in attendance today who meet the eligibility criteria to go ahead and start your application now. You're 3 steps away from winning $5,000. Now our Gap Matcher tool. You guys, I'm so excited about this one too. I personally think it's the coolest thing and such a great resource for today. So the Gap Matcher is the official USA Gap Year Fairs search tool designed to generate a list of personalized Gap Year program suggestions based on you. If you still aren't quite sure which programs you'll be checking out during the fair, I'd invite you to actually take the Gap Matcher now to get your own customized list of programs to visit. Next up, survey time. And definitely pay attention here because it's a fun one. So here at USA Gap Year Fairs, we're always looking to improve our content and make Gap Year information as accessible as possible. So that being the case, we'd love to hear about your experience today. If you complete this super quick survey within 24 hours of your event, you'll be entered for a chance to win $250. It's that simple. Thanks, Drew. And with that, I am finally going to go ahead and pass the mic over to who you've all been so patiently waiting for, wonderful Gap Year counselor, Jane Sarouhan of J2Guides. So Jane is an accredited Gap Year consultant, co-chair of the Alumni Committee, and former board member of the Gap Year Association. She's been a keynote speaker at the USA Gap Year Fair since 2011 and counts more than 25 years of experience mentoring students. We are so lucky to have her here today. Now, before Jane dives into it, I just want to remind everyone of that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to submit questions as you think of them, and we'll answer them at the end of the event. So without further ado, Jane, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire and Drew, our fearless leaders of this now entering 3 months of action-packed virtual this year and last year, and some in-person coming up gap year events. And we are here just to educate you so that you can just take this under your wing as you consider what are the next best steps for you or your child when thinking about college, vocational school, gap year, or something else altogether. So just in the way of a brief introduction, again, as Claire said, I'm Jane Sarouhan. The J2Guides stands for myself, Jane, and my fabulous co-founder and husband, Jason. And Jason and I have worked together for nearly 2 decades, but both had spent almost a decade apiece in this gap year space in experiential education prior to meeting one another. And I also took a gap year. I took mine during college and found myself face to face with some of the most inspiring mentors, some of the most inspiring friends and peers, experiences that I had really yet to face. And I found myself really immediately intrigued by what else this had in store for me. I was always a pretty decent student, but I just doubled down on my passion for what I was studying, opened my eyes to new perspectives, seeing how other people lived. All of it was so impressionable for me and the kind of person I wanted to be, what I feel like I was up for. And so lo and behold, one season of leading a program led to another, and 25 plus years have passed. So I've been gap year consulting for 12 years now. Prior to that, I directed a national nonprofit that took about 400 students overseas annually in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And prior to that, about a decade of being a field instructor, being one of those young, inspiring, hopefully, adults who was leading these programs like the ones you'll meet this evening of students all over the world. So I really, my presentation tonight, which I'm going to try to keep to a tight 20 minutes or so, is a little, all those voices, me as the gapper, as the program instructor, as the director, as the consultant, as a parent myself, all of these voices really feed into my passion and my expertise in this subject. What I want to do is equip you with some ideas so that you can actually really make the most of the breakout rooms that follow on my presentation. Some of the most outstanding gap year programs in the world are here with us this evening, but it's also the tip of the iceberg. And so some families come to these events and think, I didn't really see anything that felt like me. I can't afford some of these programs. And so they make the simple assumption and the obvious assumption that maybe a gap year is not for me. And that's probably not the case at all. So I want us to take a step back together and really just sort of talk about what a gap year is, how you might go about starting to break it down from dreaming to planning. And if you find a great match for you this evening, fantastic. And if you haven't or don't be discouraged. You will now take this toolkit and inspiration that I hope I can equip you with and go forth and continue to dive into your research. The last thing I want to say before we move on any further is that I often spend a lot of time doing some myth busting. I want to talk about, the college experience and budgeting, and I've got so much to say about all these topics. What I want to do this evening is kind of save those questions for the Ask the Expert room. So after you've circled around into meeting some other people in programs, if you haven't gotten those questions answered, please come and talk to me and Claire in the Ask the Expert room, because I want my next 20 minutes to be full of inspiration and information. And hopefully that will be really good for you. So what I'm going to do is break it down in 3 parts. And that's what you see right in front of you. I'm going to start with what do you want and why? This is the fundamental starting point in the conversation. Then we're going to talk about what do you need? And I'm going to tell you a lot about what I mean by that. And then how does it all come together? So let's keep moving on. And Drew, whenever you're ready, this idea of what is your why is something that Jason and I have been talking about for a long time with our students. So what we want in an ideal world is you start thinking about a gap year or college or whatever the next step is hopefully to engage that process with this question. What is your why? Why are you choosing this thing? Why are you thinking about this option? In this case, gap year, but I would hope and suggest that this would be a really valuable question to ask of any of the avenues you're considering. When it comes to gap year, what you see in front of you are the 8 most typically responded or reported answers when we ask our families. Academic burnout has kind of been hovering in the #1 slot for the last decade. But COVID-19 in the last year or two has also surfaced as a tiebreaker for that of why students are pursuing a gap year. I'm burnt out. I'm tired of virtual learning. I want to get back out in the world. I sort of have forgotten who I am, forgotten what I'm passionate about. A lot of parents come to us saying, I'd like to see my young adult gain in maturity and confidence. I'd like to see them develop more independent living skills. Some students are pushing into the gap year because they're interested in career exposure, getting more hands-on experience. Others to address mental or physical health challenges. Some to have fun and adventure. And almost everyone generally agrees that a level of curiosity about oneself and the world are driving them to this conversation. I will be the first to tell you that there are no wrong answers. The only wrong answer is to kind of not have an answer. So we want you to identify why this is kind of churning inside of you, or, what you hope to get out of it. The value, and you might have multiple answers. You might have identified all 8 of these in front of you. The value of going through this process is this is that macro level, 30,000 foot view. Before we start just jumping into programs and going into those rooms, we want to establish what some of that criteria is or are that you need to be safe, happy, successful, to feel like this was a fruitful and intentional gap year. The last thing I want to say before moving on is that the power of identifying your why will really help you in all the questions that for you seniors who are here, you've probably already been facing. What are you doing after you graduate? Have you made a decision about college? And for students who are already thinking about a gap year or have already committed to a gap year, this can feel like immediately put you on the defensive, let's just say. And so I love when students can kind of grab hold of that conversation. And when you've given this question a little bit of attention, you can now lean back or lean in to that and look at your well-intentioned relative or college counselor or whoever it may be, your best friend, and say, the reason why I want to take a gap year is I've worked really hard the last 4 years. I love school, but I'm feeling really academically burnout. This seems like the perfect time to take a break and just get some exposure to some of my career interests and explore the world. When you can share that statement in such a matter-of-fact and clear way and not from a defensive posture, you've kind of taken hold of that conversation in a way that I think is deeply empowering to students and will absolutely budge the needle of the conversation that ensues. Let's keep going. So you're going to start with this what is your why concept. Then what we would suggest is you get out a piece of paper, and I don't want you to do it on a computer or your phone, but would love you to pull out a journal, a huge piece of paper, pens, markers, whatever, and let yourself dream big. My dream gap year, if I could do anything, if I could go anywhere. I went for a run this morning with one of my best friends, and we were talking about the propensity of negative thoughts to take hold, which is something I usually talk about here anyway. And she had just been to a lecture the day before in which the presenter said it takes 2 seconds for a negative thought to take hold. It takes 20 seconds for a positive thought to take hold. I can't source it, but I wanted to get that for her for tonight in particular. I'll come back to it hopefully sometime. So 2 seconds for a negative thought to take hold. And what's amazing is when I share this kind of a slide or this level of content, my whole focus here is that I believe we are all masters of self-limiting thoughts. And I see students do this all the time. So they start doing the brainstorm and they're like, well, we probably can't afford it. You probably can't even do that thing on a gap year. I don't even know if I'm smart enough to do that thing. I don't know if my parents would support me to do that thing. And all of a sudden the list is blank because you haven't given yourself permission to believe that it's possible. And if this is really true, that takes 20 seconds for a positive thought to take hold, and gosh knows what else, a mantra saying it over and over, I can do this, I'm going to make it happen. We could lose that moment in those 20 seconds. And that negative hold could take hold so quickly, that negative thought so quickly that we haven't even gotten to break free from it. So try to put that negative thinking out. Let everything come out of your mind onto this piece of paper without a care as to the possibility of it, the reality of it, the cost of it, COVID, anything. I just want you to dream big because there's going to be some incredibly powerful stuff that comes out of it that inevitably you probably will be able to pursue on your gap year, regardless of your budget, regardless of your immediate concerns, if you're capable and ready for it. We probably can find a way to help you achieve that goal. So after establishing your why is this idea of an uninhibited brainstorm, giving yourself complete permission to write down every thought, no matter how crazy it may seem, down on a piece of paper or 10 pieces of paper. Okay, so that's that first step, those 2 slides combined of how do we begin this process. Moving on from there is starting to establish your perimeters. I just kind of came up with these 6, but there's no hard and fast rules here. You're not going to Google gap year definition or gap year parameters and find these. These are just ones I brought to the table. But to give you a sense of what does that mean to set parameters, just like when you're trying to do a refined search on Google and you're adding filters, we want to add some layers that take that big wide world. And now it's not from a negative or fear-based place, but now we're going to bring the practicalities of your gap year. Now we do want to talk about budget. Now we should really talk about location. What was the percentage of students that were interested in a domestic or US-based gap year? Was that 30% maybe? So exciting. So let's start putting some definition now. Again, we're still not looking to see how these are all going to fit together just yet. We've done the what is your why, we've done the brainstorm. And now we're going to really take an honest look as a family about the criteria, the parameters, the filters. We could use all those words that we need in place for this to be successful. Taking a gap year, and if I pause here for a moment and just say, when we talk about a gap year or gap time, right, it doesn't need to be a full year. We're talking about taking an intentional break. For most of you from school, for some people from career, you're taking an intentional break from your current life's trajectory in order to meaningfully engage in some other pursuits. That is literally the simplest definition to my mind. So we don't assign the definition with a place or an activity or a budget. And families often do because they have some point of contact, a relative, a neighbor, a friend, a senior who graduated the year before, and they did a thing. And that thing kind of influences your definition of a gap year. Your gap year is yours. Again, it's an intentional break in which you are pausing what you are doing in order to meaningfully pursue some other areas of interest or skill. So keeping that in mind, whether it's a summer or a semester or a year, whether it's in the United States or overseas, whether it's on your own or in a group setting, we want to then come back to this idea of starting to put into play after you dream big and start to establish what some of your core interests or goals are for this time, what some of the realities are that we're going to put in place to help contain it. Because a gap year is a stretch. Those of us in experiential education know that core to our kind of educational paradigm is to help students expand their sense of self through being in new and unfamiliar situations, whether that's in the wilderness or overseas or something else entirely. And so the experience will inherently be stressful at times. It is meant to stretch you beyond what you think you know or are capable of. It's going to stretch your perceptions, stretch your strength, stretch your language skills, stretch all kinds of things. And so we don't want the year to be a year of stress, even if it's a stretch, right? So the stretch is good, the stress, not so much. So we can't have it stress your budget too much. We don't want you to choose the solo and have that stress you out too much. You should not be treading water all year. That is not a successful gap year. So we want to find that right balance between stretch and stress. And so that's where these parameters come in, is to help put in a really nice container. You know your mental and physical health. What do you need to be successful? You know how long you want to be home at a given time. Is it 1 week? Is it 3 months? Is it longer? So think about these as some general starting points to have a conversation as a family about some of those pillars you need in place to provide some nice, tidy structure so that you can pursue those interests and goals in a safe and supported way. Let's keep moving on. So this is a lot of information here, hopefully. So how does it all come together? This is a great slide to screenshot. I think there is quite a bit here. What I like to say about it and highlight is, if you have done that brainstorm, and as I was talking, hopefully you were looking at that kind of pseudo journal entry, and I think there were 8 or 9 or 10 ideas written down there. At J2Guides, we are advising students to ultimately hone in on 2 or 3. We call those your anchors. So you are going to literally and metaphorically anchor your year with 2 or 3 fundamental goals. That list, I remember because I wrote it, has had the word Spanish on it. It had photography, it had environment. So it had lots of other things too, like surfing and I think travel and writing. So what we tend to see is when students do that brainstorm, sometimes students have 2 ideas, sometimes they have 50, but when we do the brainstorm and we come back to it again and again, inevitably students are very able to identify 2 or 3 that just like, those are my goals. This is what I want to accomplish in this year. Great. let's start to focus building your gap year around 1 or 2 primary goals. The rest of it will fill in. I know it's quite daunting to think about it. There are year-long programs, but the vast majority of gappers are doing anywhere from 2 to 6 experiences over the course of the year. So there is a lot of juggling there, but we're going to get after it one at a time. And the first program we're going to start with is the first one coming down the pipeline, which is either summer or fall for most of you. Something to think about. So you might have 2 or 3 fundamental goals you're going to be able to pursue in your gap year. Great. Another really important takeaway from this slide is please consider front loading your gap year with the most structured experience. We tell this to every student, and they will come back at the end of their gap years and say, you were right. I'm so glad I did it that way. So we want you to be with peers. In an ideal situation, most students really thrive with mentorship, instructors, peers. So you can see here in the fall, we've kind of put an anchor down that was a structured group program with peers and leaders. This could be a group studying marine biology and getting scuba certified in Honduras. This could be on a study abroad program in Spain. This could be living with a group in Oregon and doing a Jewish focused social justice type program. It could be in many locations with a wide variety of content, but the fundamental piece here is that it's with peers and it's highly facilitated. That kind of experience will also cost the most of your entire gap year. This will probably be the most costly piece, like a solid half of your budget, if not more, could be spent. And the programs you will meet tonight predominantly really fit this mold really well. Now, many students do back-to-back group programs, so that in their winter, they will jump to a second group program. But I would say probably at least 75% of our students will move on to something else. And maybe if it's all working, we start to strip away some of the scaffolding, and students can start to do more of a deep dive into another area of interest, another anchor, and maybe strip away some of that extra support, some of that level of supervision. I'm not saying that we're leaving students out on their own to hang out and dry, but we're really trying to help encourage them to increasingly step into their levels of independence in young adulthood. And the beauty of this model is these programs that we're front loading in the fall are designed to equip students to handle themselves as young adults out in the world. So a lot is done for them in many ways, and yet the programs themselves are trying to hand off more responsibility to the students over the course of that semester. So that fall semester may end, but the learning does not go away. Students have that as part of them, and they are much more savvy travelers, researchers, you name it, as the year goes on. We want to leverage that. The other phenomenal thing that happens from a solid fall program is students make connections. And now we're stepping into kind of the lifelong skills and hacks of networking. So their instructors have done all kinds of amazing things and have been to all kinds of amazing places. The friends they make, and many students report they meet some of the best friends of their lives, or wanting to find a travel buddy for the spring, where you can see we've placed the most independent experience would do quite well in the spring. Nearly every student we talk to wants to have like a backpacking in Europe or Australia or a road trip in the United States. They see themselves wanting to really lean into their independence. I love that. And I think it's best placed towards the end of the year. And again, what the beauty of that is now 3, 6, maybe 7 months of experience under one's belt and connections and friendships made along the way that might circle back and join in that final spring adventure. So this is the idea of taking all of your brainstorm, those filters or parameters, and trying to hone in on a few fundamental goals for the gap year and placing them on this kind of progressive timeline, starting with more structure with this hope of moving towards less structure and more independence. The last thing I want to say, because I skipped right over it, is I did put a motion right there around home making money in the summer. Many students will actually do that in the winter as well. So a lot of students will come home at the end of their fall program for the holidays and work for a month or 2 months, save money and put it back into that spring adventure, which I think is a brilliant idea. So working and saving money, great idea as part of a gap year. Let's keep moving on. I want to end, and then we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A, which I'm really excited about, with just 2 student profiles. These are 2 alumni of ours, both who gapped last year in arguably the hardest COVID gap year. Things have changed dramatically this year, and they will undoubtedly be changed a lot for next year. And that is really addressed to you seniors who are thinking about gapping. And the big question everyone's coming to is, what have kids been able to do for the last year or 2 years? A lot. Certainly last year, in the fall in particular, much less was available, but we're really getting back on track with travel destinations in particular. But anyway, I want to feature two students who are just such inspirations to me. All of them are, but to highlight two separate stories and to also show how they built their year on this progression, just to kind of really seal this information. I am going to read this quotation because I just love what Emma had to say. I took a gap year to explore life outside of school and to get real world experience in a field that I'm interested in. I am so glad I took the leap. This year has been the most fulfilling of my life. I mean, I do read this quote from time to time, and I do get goosebumps every time, because what parent, what educator wants to hear anything else other than that? This is the most fulfilling year of my life. And you can see what Emma's done. Yes, Emma's interested in a field in medicine. Doesn't really have a lot of hands-on experience. What 18-year-old does? So in the fall of 2020, she stayed home and studied to be an EMT. And so she budged our model a little bit, which you should. You've got to make it yours. And she then did pursue that facilitated group program in Hawaii. So it was time to get out of the house, time to get out of the textbooks. She worked really hard to pass her exams, had a phenomenal group program in Hawaii, studying conservation, environment, culture, made wonderful friends, came back and got a job in an ambulance and worked for the next 3 months, I think, into the summer on an ambulance as probably now a 19-year-old woman, and is now a freshwoman at Northwestern doing great. So she was like, and she said to me, like, I don't think I want to work on an ambulance. That was never my lifelong aspiration, but I have such a better sense of like, I'm good in triage. I'm kind of good in crisis. I had a thought I might be. I love it. And she loved the people in the ambulance. So she's getting a sense of the people drawn to the work, her own ability and natural inclination towards it. What a win. So this was an example of her why was about academic burnout as well. She had the college acceptance she was excited about and deferred, but it really was about a break to address burnout, and she did want that career exploration. Let's take a look at Zach, who's my next student profile, I believe. I'm going to start reading his quote as well because I love this. I feel like I finally found my people. Especially during COVID, it just felt amazing to be able to pot up and go through these incredible hands-on experiences with other like-minded peers. Remember fall 2020, pre-vaccine, no one knowing if we have to like bleach our groceries when they come home. And all of a sudden, after a 10-day quarantine and a series of antigen and PCR tests, this group is now potted and unmasked. He ended up choosing a conservation and outdoor wilderness program in the American Southwest. This was not a young man who had much interest, or so he thought, in backpacking. His passion originally was to travel the world on his gap year. He knew he wanted to gap long before COVID. The travel he wanted was off the table for the fall, and he pivoted. He is passionate about environmental science, policy, thinks that's going to be a pursuit of his in college, but just wanted to be with people and desperately wanted to make good friends and be with an intellectually stimulating but kind of outdoorsy group of people. Found himself in a program and hit his stride. I'm just going to fast forward to the end to say that Zach is crushing it at Duke. I said Zook. I'm going to remember that one. And I just heard that he has applied and been accepted to be an outdoor leader on the spring break trip for the Outings Club at Duke. So he found a passion he didn't even know he had, and really stepped into his voice as a leader, and is now sharing that love of the outdoors and his skills with other young students at Duke, which I just think is awesome. So Zach really wanted to take on some independent travel, and getting fluent in Spanish was a big goal of his. We hear that a lot with students wanting to take those 4 or 6 or 8 years of classroom language and be like, I feel like I could understand it, but I can't speak a word. A semester or so of immersion of living in the place where it's spoken generally does wonders for students, even if they just feel like they can't do another classroom lesson. You put them in the environment, they've got to use it. So Zach went to Costa Rica. He'd spent the bulk of his budget on that fall program. So he did a series of lower cost work exchange options. Many of you have heard of WOOF or Workaway or HelpX. Zach pulled together a combination of those. It was an opportunity where he would work, and in exchange for 2 or 4 or 6 hours a day would receive room and board. I could talk more about this in the Ask the Expert room, but I'm bringing it up here more as a way to show that he was able to stretch out 3 months in Costa Rica on kind of a shoestring budget, but also do it in a really meaningful way and obviously still have a great time. And I think for Zach, finding his people, this is a young man who his parents are from the Northeast, but he was raised in the South. And I think he never quite felt like he had found his people. And that's why that comment, I think, is so potent, because all of a sudden stepping into the gap year world, and this is a question we hear a lot from people, how will I know if I like the people? And it seems like a big risk coming to these programs. Making friendships is probably the number one thing we hear from students at the end of the gap year, is they feel like they just met so many inspiring and incredible people that became friends for life. So I'm going to end my presentation there. And I think the next slide is just my brief contact information. So please feel free to jot any of that down. While you're doing that, I want to also mention, if you haven't started putting any questions in the Q&A, this would be a great time, because Claire and I would love to address them. This is a bit of a segue into your next session of starting to meet programs. Now with COVID, one of the genies that's probably never going back into the bottle, which I'm thrilled about, is how much is available online. I know it gets exhausting, but these fairs 2 years ago were in person exclusively. We did not do this. So I saw you Seattle and Portland people, and I speak out at those events every year. And I'm actually really heartbroken to not be there, because I love the Pacific Northwest. I lived in California for a decade. So my best friends live in Seattle and Portland. So I'm a little sad to not be there this year. But the benefit is you didn't have to leave your house today. And hopefully you've got your feet up with dinner or coffee or a glass of wine and can hear this. Well, that has maintained true for all of these organizations that are offering free webinars often. So if you don't hit every room tonight, make note of the programs you wanted to meet with, see what kind of free webinars. Everyone's going to get on the phone with you for free, including me. So get on the phone with programs. Follow programs on social media. People have really good social media presence where they are trying to communicate their message, give invaluable tips about travel or gapping, and are often highlighting alumni, which is certainly a big focus for us. So I think following programs that you're remotely interested in, and simply unfollow when you've gotten what you needed out of it. But there's so much available, and has been, of course, for a while, but I think COVID has really boosted the accessibility to sort of passively and anonymously gain a lot of information, which I think in the early stages, when you might be feeling a little nervous and sort of some trepidation, is a perfectly fine way to start your initial research. Sooner than later, once you kind of get past some of that veneer, you do want to pick up the phone. You want to call these programs. You want to ask to speak to their alumni, but you're going to have some of that great contact this evening. I think that's the bulk of what I'll do for now, and leave us with enough time for, which is right on, I think, about 10 minutes for Q&A. And then Claire has a few closing slides, and then we will start opening up all of those wonderful rooms.
Thank you, Jane. That was amazing. Oh my goodness. And so cool about Zach and Duke. I think it fits. I think that's the way to go. All right, but yes, let's jump into Q&A now. So just a quick reminder, if you're tuning in from your mobile device or from your desktop, just click on that Q&A box, and that's how you'll be able to ask your questions for Jane. Looks like we already got 2 really great questions in here, Jane. So let's start off with this first one from Charlotte. Charlotte asks, what is the percentage of students who defer college to do a gap year versus people who apply to college a year late after their gap year?
Unmuting, looking at the message. I don't have exact numbers, so I'll give you a ballpark, Charlotte, of what I see for J2Guides clients. I would say 85, 90% of our families have received an acceptance and deferred. Yeah, but I think, and then the other solid percent are either applying for the first time or reapplying during their gap years. And I've seen both work really well. So again, I don't think there's a wrong way. I think if your student or child has any energy around the college process, of course, to do that as a senior when there's momentum and support makes a lot of sense. And I think if someone's half-hearted, I say apply to 1 or 2 just to like grease the wheels. and know that maybe you're going to do a more assertive application process. There's some students who didn't have a great junior year, but crushed it senior year, and that's the year they want to showcase. Well, applications went in before you were really able to showcase your senior year. So sometimes that's why students apply later. And if that's the case, if applying during your gap year is your preference or just what's right for your family, then there's lots of ways to do it, where we can just be very deliberate about getting your ducks in a row before you leave for the gap year. Maybe doing a shorter program in the fall. Most of these semester programs are going to end in November, some into December, but there's usually plenty of time to come back and put the finishing touches. Or some students are submitting their applications from their fall. The only thing there is I just don't want students so preoccupied with the college process that they're missing the whole point of that fall gap semester, or maybe they're just home in the fall semester applying. But I often find students who didn't apply senior year, or for whatever reason are applying during the gap year, they often need a little juice. They need like something to feel excited about. So even if there was a 4 to 8 week experience in the summer or fall, just to get that student feeling alive again, that really translates in the college application process. Even if you're not writing about your gap year, I just think the energy is really there. So it can really work. And I can address that more now or later.
Great advice. Thank you so much, Jane. Yes. Definitely, Charlotte, if you have any other follow-up questions with that, pop into the Ask an Expert room. We'll be there all night. Jane, now getting to this question from Sarah, who asks, are there any faith-based gap year programs?
Definitely. There are the first two that just come to mind, and I'll do a Christian gap year program and a Jewish. I saw again some Portland name mentions out there. So TVNU is a Jewish-based program in Portland, Oregon. I think they are wonderful. And it's a residential program in Portland, Oregon. Students live together. They don't have to be Jewish to attend, but a large percentage is. So the Judaism is, a part of the program, but it's very much service, social service and social justice focused. And when I visited the program last year, students were building tiny houses for houseless adults as one of their primary projects. It was really outstanding and a great leadership team there. Another program is One Life, and that's a Christian gap year program. So those might just give you an example of a Jewish and Christian. I don't know as much about One Life. I had talked to a student who just come from it and she loved it, but I don't know much about it. But we could talk more about that separately as well in the Ask the Expert room.
Great. Thank you, Jane.
Yeah.
And I think we have time for one more question. And this is a really fun one from Maria, who asks, she says she sees a lot of programs in Spanish speaking countries that don't require much, if any, Spanish experience. Are these types of programs any good for more advanced Spanish speakers or students who really want to work towards fluency?
Such a good question. So I would say like the programs that you see this evening, Maria, are because they don't have a Spanish requirement. And when groups of North Americans travel around together, there's going to be a lot of banter in English. So I think these group programs that you'll meet tonight, and I hope none of them hate me for saying this, are not the go-to for Spanish acquisition if we're looking to move from conversational to fluency. If that's the case, then I start to lean towards a whole bunch of other kinds of options. EF is a good language option. EF runs a gap semester program. I actually prefer to use them for their language schools. They have language schools in many cities all over the world, much more independent. So I tend to have my students, remember on that progression slide, the winter said deep dive, and I think there was a picture of a young woman scuba diving. A deep dive for language is great right in there. So someone's done that generalized experience, maybe in Central or South America, maybe in Spain. So they've had the exposure, but then to really hit it home, I think 8 to 12 weeks in a language school or in an internship, maybe even living with a homestay family, but not necessarily part of a traveling group program is going to be the best way to achieve fluency.
Great. Thank you so much, Jane. Well, with that, I think that it is time to resume our slides, Drew. But one really quick note, if you did not have a question that was answered, or rather, if you have a question that still hasn't been answered, or if you just want to continue that conversation, again, please, please, please jump into the Ask an Expert room. that's really your resource tonight to talk to Jane and really continue that conversation and get all your questions answered. So it's a great resource. Please utilize it. Now I'm mixing up all my words. So it sounds like we got to bring this webinar to a close. Okay, so I did just want to circle back quickly to our recently launched USA Gap Year Fair Scholarship for anyone who might have joined this webinar late. So again, this is a $5,000 Gap Time Scholarship. It just opened yesterday on March 1st. So I'd really highly encourage anybody thinking about taking Gap Time to apply. It honestly, again, only takes 2 minutes to begin your application, and the requirements are few and they're simple. Just as long as you are a US resident, you're between the ages of 17 and 20, and you're interested in planning on taking Gap Time with one of our program providers in the summer 2022 semester or the fall 2022 semester, you could win those $5,000. So definitely check out the link that Drew just dropped in the chat to learn more. Okay, and onwards to my final reminder of the evening, which is to utilize your Attendee Hub. Drew is dropping the link to that hub one more time in the chat. And again, you'll use the Zoom links in the hub to navigate into the info sessions and Q&As of our fantastic lineup of Gap Year program providers. So without further ado, it is time to kick off the fair. This is your chance to connect with program providers. So I recommend you unmute your mics and chat with the presenters. They're really looking forward to meeting you. Well, thank you all so much again for joining us today. And I wish you an excellent fair. And I hope to see many of you in the Ask an Expert room. Bye, everyone.